At 62, I discovered that silence is worth its weight in gold. My house at 47 Alameda Sapresti has been my refuge ever since I retired as a structural engineer. Its walls hold my books, my calculations, and most of all, my peace. 3 months ago, a 15-centimeter scar started marking my chest, a reminder of a heart surgery that made me rethink my priorities. Order and logic have always been my backbone, but now I also need quiet. If it weren't for Susan Mitchell, maybe I'd manage just fine. House 49, separated from mine by a perfectly trimmed hedge, belongs to the woman who seems to have made my life her personal project. Ever since her husband died 5 years ago, Susan turned her loneliness into an obsession with keeping the neighborhood under control. It started with small incidents, complaints about the height of my grass, notices to the neighborhood association because my trash could be seen for too long on Tuesdays. The security cameras I installed 2 years ago became the subject of a petition she circulated, claiming they invaded her privacy. No one signed except her. I try to keep my distance. I avoid confrontations. I documented every incident in a folder I keep in my office. Maybe it's the engineer in me, cataloging data for an analysis that'll probably never happen. People say Susan is just a lonely widow, but when our eyes meet on the sidewalk, there's something calculated behind hers. There's method in her insolence. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get access to more stories like this. The pain started as a subtle tightness. I was alone making dinner when I felt the first discomfort spreading in my left arm. I recognized the signs. It wasn't my first heart attack. I managed to grab the phone and call emergency services before I collapsed onto my kitchen floor. The paramedics arrived in 7 minutes. I was drifting between consciousness and darkness when the ambulance doors opened. One paramedic jumped out while another started attaching electrodes to my chest. That's when I heard Susan's shrill voice. "You can't park blocking my driveway. That's against the association's rules." The paramedic tried to explain the situation while monitoring my vitals. My blood pressure was dropping. The world felt distant, but her voice cut right through the haze. "I'm calling a tow truck if you don't move right now." I felt the ambulance jolt. Through the ajar door, I saw Susan banging on the side of the vehicle with a metal flashlight. The windshield cracked from one of the hits. The driver got out to handle her as the other paramedic administered adrenaline into my system. "Sir, stay with me, sir." The lights seemed to flicker. The last thing I remember was Susan yelling about her rights while the paramedics fought to keep their cool. Then, everything went dark. 3 days in the hospital gave me time to reflect. The cardiologist said I was lucky. If I'd been 5 minutes later, the consequences would have been irreversible. On the morning of my discharge, I got an unexpected visit. "Mr. Bennett, I'm Kyle, one of the paramedics who attended your emergency." Kyle looked awkward, constantly glancing at the door as if he feared being caught there. "I needed to show you something," he said, holding out his cell phone. "We usually don't do this." But the photos showed Susan attacking the ambulance while I was being treated. There were also short videos, her threatening to sue the paramedics, demanding identification, pounding on the vehicle repeatedly. She delayed our treatment by almost 4 minutes. It could have... Kyle didn't finish the sentence. I filed a formal complaint at the local police station 2 days later. Sergeant Thompson barely looked up from his computer as he typed my statement. "With no injuries or permanent damage, this will be treated as a minor disturbance," he explained indifferently. "Ma'am, you're over 60 with no prior record. It'll probably just be a warning." I insisted that she had damaged an emergency vehicle and compromised my treatment, but Thompson just printed out the report and handed it to me without any enthusiasm. Back to my routine, something was bugging me. My security cameras should have recorded the incident, but when I checked the footage, I only found static screens during those critical 2 hours. The system had failed right during the heart attack. Coincidence? I ran a quick test. The cameras were working perfectly now. Then I checked the access logs and discovered that someone had remotely logged into the system that night. I wasn't tech-savvy enough to trace the source, but I knew who could help. Mike Wilson, my 30-year friend and digital security expert, came the next day. He spent hours poring over my system, focused and quiet, until he finally whistled. "Rich, my cameras weren't just turned off. Someone rerouted the data to another server before cutting the connection." Mike showed me some codes and logs that I barely understood, but his conclusion was clear. This wasn't a coincidence or a technical glitch. Someone deliberately blocked my cameras during the incident. "Who would do that?" I asked, though I already had a hunch. "Someone with resources. This isn't amateur work. It was carefully planned and executed. The real question is, why go to all that trouble?" I watched House 49 for 3 days before making a decision. Susan stuck to her flawless routine: gardening at 9, shopping at 11, and a book club on Wednesdays. I picked a Thursday to knock on her door when the neighborhood would be quieter. Susan answered with a forced smile that faded when she saw me. "What do you want, Mr. Bennett? I'm busy." "I want to talk about the night of my heart attack." Her eyes narrowed. "I already spoke with the authorities about that misunderstanding." "I'm not here to talk about the ambulance," I lied. "I'm here to ask about my security cameras." The effect was immediate. Susan paled, her fingers clenching the door. For a moment, I thought she might faint. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she replied, her voice trembling. "Someone hacked my system that night. They rerouted the recordings. We have evidence." Susan glanced beyond me, toward the street as if looking for someone. The confidence she usually had was gone. "I need you to leave right now," she said abruptly. "I have nothing to do with your technical problems." Before I could press further, Susan shut the door. But not before I noticed something odd, genuine fear in her eyes. It wasn't the look of someone guilty of vandalism. It was the look of someone terrified of the consequences of something much bigger. I went back home disturbed, convinced that there was more to this story than just a nosy neighbor. Susan didn't act alone that night, and for the first time, I wondered if she too was just a pawn in a bigger game. I installed extra cameras pointed solely at Susan's house, hooked up to an independent system that Mike set up. The recordings were streamed to a private server that only he and I could access. I told no one about this decision. A part of me wondered if it was even ethical, but the part that barely survived the incident needed to understand what was going on. For 2 weeks, nothing unusual happened. Susan followed her meticulous routine, out for her morning coffee, returning with her mail precisely at 10:45, watering her begonias at 5:20. I wondered if I was wasting my time, if the ambulance incident was just the tip of years of small hostilities. Then, in the 3rd week, at 2:17 a.m., the infrared cameras picked up some movement. A black SUV with no visible identification pulled up half a block from Susan's house. A man got out and walked over to her door, not through the main entrance but from the back, across her little side garden. Susan greeted him in a bathrobe, as if she'd been expecting him. They talked for about 6 minutes before he handed her an envelope. She opened it, glanced at the contents briefly, and nodded. The next night, the same thing happened. SUV, man, envelope. This time, Susan seemed agitated, gesturing emphatically, while the visitor stayed calm. At one point, she tried to give the envelope back, but he refused with a gesture that, even on camera, exuded authority. I zoomed in on the footage, trying to identify the man. Tall, around 6'3", with neat graying hair and a perfectly cut dark suit. His face stayed partly hidden in the shadows, compounded by an unflattering camera angle. Still, his presence revealed one crucial thing: Susan wasn't acting alone. On the 5th day of surveillance, I captured something even more intriguing. Susan left at 11:40 p.m., driving her own car, a behavior we'd never seen in her routine records. I tracked her by the GPS coordinates that Mike's system had provided. She drove for about 40 minutes until she reached an industrial area on the outskirts of town, parking near what looked like an abandoned warehouse. Using the telescope I bought specifically for this investigation, I watched from a distance as Susan met with 3 people: the suited man from the SUV and 2 other individuals I couldn't fully identify. The meeting lasted about 20 minutes. They went over several folders. At one point, Susan looked like she was being reprimanded, her body language totally submissive. When I got back home that night, I found my gate ajar. Nothing seemed out of place inside, but a feeling of intrusion hung in the air. I checked my interior cameras. No signs of unauthorized entry. Still, the unease lingered, as if someone wanted me to know that my privacy wasn't guaranteed. The next day, while checking my mailbox, I caught Susan watching me from her window. Our eyes met briefly before she retreated back inside. It wasn't her typical defiant look. There was something different, a blend of worry and resignation. I went to the municipal library and dug into local digital archives about Susan Mitchell. I found that before moving to our neighborhood, she had worked as a real estate agent for almost 2 decades. Her professional bio mentioned a specialty in strategic acquisitions for urban development. The company she worked for, Blackwood Realty Group, had been investigated about 7 years ago for shady negotiation practices, but the case was dropped due to inconclusive evidence. William Blackwood, the owner, appeared in some corporate photos, a tall man with graying hair, always in impeccable suits. The resemblance to Susan's late-night visitor was undeniable. Pieces began to fit together, forming a disturbing pattern. That night, I made up my mind. I would wait for Susan to go out again. What happened 3 days later? And this time, instead of tailing her, I'd break into her house. I needed concrete evidence, not just theories based on coincidences and assumptions. Susan's lock gave way surprisingly easily. Using techniques I'd picked up from online tutorials, I managed to get inside her place in less than 2 minutes. The interior was meticulously organized, mirroring the owner's controlling personality. I found her office on the second floor, a small room dominated by a computer and several color-coded folders. A red folder marked Desenvolvimento Alameda Cipreste immediately caught my attention. Inside, I found what looked like part of a larger plan. Detailed maps of the neighborhood with houses marked in red for those already acquired, yellow for those in negotiation, and green for priority targets. My place was marked in green, along with 5 other strategically located properties. The documents detailed an urban renewal plan to transform our residential community into a high-end commercial complex. Internal memos discussed tactics for pressuring reluctant homeowners. One in particular sent a chill down my spine. RB 47 continues to resist after initial pressure tactics. Suggestion: intensify wear-down tactics through asset SM. Medical history indicates a heart vulnerability that can be exploited to devalue the property. I carefully photographed every document. In a locked drawer, which took a bit more effort to open, I found correspondence exchanged between Susan and William Blackwood, dating back up to 8 months. The letters revealed a complex relationship. Susan was specifically recruited for our neighborhood because of her real estate background, but recent communications showed that she was being pressured to deliver results. Keep in mind that your financial stability agreement depends entirely on the success of this venture, read one of the letters signed by Blackwood. Continued failure to acquire the key properties will result in not only a revision of your position, but also a review of the mortgage agreement on your current residence. As I snapped pictures of that document, I heard a car pulling into the driveway. I looked out the window and saw Susan arriving much earlier than expected. I quickly stuffed the evidence in my pocket and looked for an exit. The back door was closest, but it would have exposed me if Susan came in through the front. I opted for the bathroom window that opened into the side garden, where the overgrown bushes provided some cover. I managed to slip out just seconds before I heard the front door swing open. Crouching among the bushes, I watched as Susan entered hurriedly, carrying more folders. She looked agitated, repeatedly checking her cell phone. Back in my house, I organized all the evidence: the photos, the surveillance records, the Blackwood documents. Everything pointed to an elaborate scheme of forced property acquisition for a commercial development project. Susan was just a pawn in this game, though willingly at first. The next morning, I decided to confront her directly. I waited until she returned from her morning coffee run and positioned myself in her path. Her face hardened when she saw me. "We need to talk, Susan," I said in a calm voice. "I have nothing to say to you," she replied, trying to pass by. "I know about Blackwood Realty Group, about the development project, and about how you were instructed to pressure me because of my heart condition." She froze, the color draining from her face. For a moment, I thought she might faint. Her eyes scanned the empty street as if she were looking for help. "You don't understand what you're getting into," she finally whispered. "They are not people you mess with. Neither am I, Susan. I broke into your house last night. I've got copies of everything." Her eyes widened at the revelation, but instead of the anger I expected, I saw something surprising: relief. "Come in," she said, gesturing toward her door. "We can't talk here." Once inside, Susan collapsed into an armchair, suddenly looking far older and more fragile. "It started 3 years ago," she explained in a shaky voice. "After Herbert died, I was left with massive debts he'd hidden from me. Mortgages, loans, medical treatments not covered by insurance. Blackwood showed up offering a solution: work for him as the local facilitator, using my real estate background to help acquire properties for his new development." Her hands trembled as she poured water for both of us. At first it seemed legit, just identifying willing sellers, offering fair evaluations. But soon the tactics changed. Blackwood wanted me to create problems, to psychologically pressure the resistant neighbors. When I tried to back off, he revealed that my own house no longer belonged to me. He had bought my bank debt. Susan then explained how she was specifically instructed to keep an eye on me because of the strategic location of my property. My heart condition was pinpointed as a vulnerability to be exploited. The ambulance incident wasn't premeditated, but when it happened, she was ordered to escalate the situation, to create a documented medical emergency that could later be used to devalue the property or force a sale due to health concerns. I had no idea they'd hack your cameras. That went beyond what they told me. I'm being watched too, Richard. They have eyes everywhere. I began to realize that Susan was both a perpetrator and a victim in this scheme. Her little acts of hostility over the years were genuine, but the ambulance incident marked a turning point when outside manipulation became the norm. Who else is involved? I asked. Who's behind the technical stuff like rerouting my camera feeds? Susan hesitated before finally revealing that Blackwood employed a team of specialists, ex-military and hackers, to handle any significant resistance. Every month, they received detailed reports on each targeted property, including exploitable vulnerabilities. As we talked, I sensed that we were being watched. A black car quietly parked on the other side of the street. Susan noticed my gaze and paled. "They're here," she whispered. "You need to go, now." "Come with me," I offered. "We can take this evidence to the police together." Susan shook her head. "It won't work. Blackwood has connections in the local police." "Why do you think your complaint about the ambulance incident was dropped so quickly?" Before I could answer, her phone rang. She answered with trembling hands, listened silently for a few seconds, and then hung up. "I have 1 hour to deliver all the documents related to you," she said, her voice breaking. "They know you were here. They say that if you don't cooperate, they'll renegotiate our deal." At that moment, I made a decision. We need more proof. Proof that ties Blackwood directly to these coercive tactics. The next few days were spent planning meticulously. Mike installed additional surveillance systems, beefed up my digital security, and helped me prepare a complete dossier. Every document, every photo, every recording was organized chronologically, painting a clear picture of the predatory scheme happening in our neighborhood. We discovered that this pattern was repeating in 3 other neighborhoods in the city. In each one, Blackwood had recruited a local facilitator, usually someone financially vulnerable or with past legal troubles that could be exploited. The tactic was always the same: gradual pressure, social isolation of those who resisted, and eventually creating situations that forced a sale. I identified other neighbors who had abruptly moved in the past 2 years. Through careful research and a few strategic phone calls, I got in touch with 3 of them. Their stories were variations of the same strategy: unexplained plumbing problems, recurring electrical interferences, sudden code violations reported for their properties, even fabricated accusations of illegal activities. "It started with small incidents," explained Eleanor Simmons, a retired teacher who sold her house 6 months ago. "Complaints about noises I never made. Then my car got vandalized 3 times in 2 weeks. When I had a mysterious leak that destroyed half the house's structure, I decided I'd had enough and sold it for way less than its market value, just to get out." The pattern was consistent. The most disturbing part was finding out that every local asset like Susan eventually disappeared after they'd served their purpose. Former facilitators were found in distant cities, living in rough conditions, or simply vanished without a trace. Blackwood's organization discarded its tools when they were no longer needed. While I continued gathering this evidence, I kept only limited contact with Susan. She still acted as usual to avoid suspicion, but we communicated via notes left in predetermined spots. Her situation was deteriorating. The nighttime visitor was showing up more frequently, and the demands were increasing. In her last note, she simply wrote, "I don't have much time. I knew I had to act, but I couldn't trust the local police." The solution came from James Parker, an old friend who'd become a state prosecutor. Our kids grew up together before my ex-wife moved with them out of state. James had jurisdiction over organized financial crimes and, more importantly, no ties with the local authorities that might be compromised. "This is way bigger than I imagined, Rich," said James after reviewing my dossier. "We're talking extortion, real estate market manipulation, coercion, possible bribery of officials, not to mention the direct attack during your medical emergency. The question is, are you prepared for the fallout if you push this forward? These people are dangerous. I nearly died because of them," I replied, "and I'm not the only one they've hurt. If we do nothing, they're going to keep ruining lives." James nodded gravely. "I'm launching an official investigation under state jurisdiction. That'll let us skirt any local influence Blackwood might have, but you'll need to be our main witness, and that puts you at risk." "I'm already at risk," I said. "At least now I'm fighting instead of just waiting for the next attack." Over the next 2 weeks, I worked directly with James's team. My house turned into a makeshift operations center, with investigators combing through documents and forensic technicians analyzing the digital records that Mike and I had collected. Testimonies were recorded, connections made, patterns identified. The case against Blackwood and his organization took shape quickly. Susan agreed to testify in exchange for partial immunity. Her cooperation was crucial as she provided inside details about the hierarchy of the organization, their communication methods, and most importantly, the location of the financial records that held all the evidence. Blackwood keeps a separate server with all the real records, Susan explained in a recorded statement. The official transactions are just the tip of the iceberg. The real documents show how much was paid in bribes, who was coerced, and which properties were artificially devalued. In a coordinated operation, state agents executed simultaneous search warrants at 4 different locations: Blackwood Realty's main office, William Blackwood's personal residence, the industrial warehouse where Susan held her meetings, and a remote data center identified through the information we provided. I didn't take part in the operation directly, but James kept me updated. The raid was impressively successful. Servers were seized, incriminating documents recovered, and more than a dozen people detained for questioning, including 2 local police officers. William Blackwood wasn't found at any of the locations. Apparently tipped off, he had vanished hours before the raids. An arrest warrant was issued immediately. "That's just the beginning," James explained when he came by to update me personally. "We have enough evidence to kick off a federal case. Real estate fraud spanning state lines, market manipulation, organized extortion. The Department of Justice is taking over now. Blackwood might have temporarily escaped, but his accounts are frozen, and his associates are scrambling to save their own skins." I sank into my favorite armchair, exhausted yet relieved. For the first time in months, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. The system that nearly killed me was being dismantled piece by piece. "And Susan?" I asked. "She's under police protection until her trial," James replied. "She knows too much. She's a priority target. She'll be placed in a witness protection program once we formally record her testimony tomorrow." That night, I slept better than I had in months. The long battle finally seemed to be nearing its end. Back in my office, I carefully backed up all the evidence we'd collected. A small victory in taking a stand against injustice. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get access to more stories like this. I woke up to the news. Susan Mitchell had vanished overnight despite being under police protection. The officer assigned to guard her was found unconscious with a head injury. The security cameras at the hotel where she was staying had been disabled exactly between 2:15 and 2:40 a.m. "How was this possible?" I asked James over the phone, anxiety clenching my chest. "She was under police protection. Someone on the inside," James replied, his voice tense. "We're investigating everyone involved in the operation. There's an active manhunt, but..." He didn't need to finish. We both knew the chances of finding Susan alive were shrinking by the hour. I spent the day in constant contact with James and his team, providing any additional information that might help locate Susan. I returned home at dusk, exhausted and worried. The neighborhood felt strangely silent, and House 49 was dark and abandoned. As I opened my front door, I noticed a white envelope on the doormat. No return address, no postal marks. Just my name written in the unmistakable handwriting of Susan. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief message. "Richard, by the time you read this, I'll be long gone. Not by choice. I tried to do the right thing in the end, but I underestimated their reach. Blackwood has contingencies for contingencies. I found something you need to know. This goes beyond just real estate. The urban renewal is only the surface. Beneath those new commercial complexes, they're planning underground storage facilities for something I can't fully identify. Coded documents mention Project Artemis, and underground installations that aren't shown on any official blueprint. Be careful. Your security protocols have flaws. They're watching you right now. You'll be next unless you stop immediately. Even this state investigation is just a nuisance to them. They have connections at levels we can't even imagine. I'm sorry for everything. SM." I read the letter 3 times, my heart racing. I instinctively looked out the window and saw a black SUV parked on the other side of the street. It hadn't been there when I arrived. I grabbed my phone to call James, but there was no signal. I tried the landline. Dead. I quickly moved to the office, gathering backups of the evidence. Mike's isolated camera system was still running. Through it, I saw 3 men approaching the house from the back. There wasn't time for much else. I grabbed only the essentials: a flash drive with the files, my cell phone, even though it had no signal, Susan's letter, and my personal documents. I left through the front door while the intruders were still circling the house. The black SUV started moving as soon as it spotted me. I ran along the side of the neighbor's house, cutting through the gardens I'd known since childhood. Decades living in the neighborhood gave me an advantage when it came to knowing the area. There was a small park 3 blocks away with dense trees that provided temporary cover. As I ran, one thought kept echoing in my mind. This is no longer just about houses or land. The Project Artemis Susan mentioned suggested something much bigger, something far more sinister. Why would a real estate developer need secret underground facilities? What kind of operation would require that level of manipulation and coercion? I reached the park and plunged into the thickest vegetation. Night had fully fallen, offering extra cover. I tried my phone again and, surprisingly, got a weak signal. I dialed James. "Rich, where are you?" His voice came in broken bursts. "We've been trying to reach you for hours." "They're after me," I whispered. "They broke into my house." "Susan left me a letter, James. This is way bigger than we thought. Something about Project Artemis, underground installations." "Don't say any more on the phone," he cut in. "We need to get you under protection immediately. Tell me exactly where you are." I hesitated. Paranoia was taking over. If they'd gotten to Susan under police protection, who was going to guarantee my safety? "James, how can I be sure?" "Our last chess game," he replied immediately, as if he understood my hesitation. "You beat me with that tower sacrifice I didn't see coming. Then you said that engineering and chess have something in common. You have to look beyond the obvious structures." That private conversation convinced me. I gave him my location and waited, hidden among the dense trees, watching the lights of vehicles slowly pass through the park as they looked for me. 15 minutes later, a dark van parked at the park's south entrance. 3 federal agents got out, using the visual codes James had briefed me on. I cautiously approached, still suspicious. As we drove away from the park, I took one last look at the neighborhood I'd called home for decades. The quiet houses, the well-kept gardens, the veneer of normalcy that hid a network of manipulation and corruption. Somewhere out there, William Blackwood was still free, and the mystery of Project Artemis remained unsolved. The battle that started with a nosy neighbor and a vandalized ambulance had grown into something far larger and more dangerous. As the van sped down the highway toward an undisclosed safe location, I pulled out Susan's letter again. Her final words echoed like both a warning and a promise. "You'll be next." But unlike Susan, I wouldn't be alone in this fight. And unlike Blackwood, I had nothing to hide. The truth, even if it was dangerous, was my only protection now. And I was determined to expose it completely, no matter how deep the conspiracy went. The black SUV never followed us, but I knew that didn't mean we were safe. It was only the start of a new chapter in this story. A chapter I was determined to control, no matter the cost. Subscribe to the channel and hit like to get access to more stories like this.